Hello third year and welcome to week 3 of your biology lessons as part of Kinross High's virtual school. This week we're going to be focusing on something called biotic factors. So previously to now we have looked at biomes and we've looked at ecosystems. In this lesson we're going to look at what biotic factors are and how they can influence our environment. And in the next lessons we'll be looking at how we can go about sampling biotic factors. So what we're looking for you to be able to do is learning about how living things can impact each other. You need to be able to give the definition of a biotic factor, list 3 biotic factors, and pick one and explain how it can impact biodiversity. So you should already have seen the starter slides, and your picture prompt for this lesson was to have a little look at this desert scene and think about what sorts of factors might influence the biodiversity of this area. Now we know that biodiversity just means the variety of the living things in that environment. So you're thinking about what sorts of factors can affect the variety of the things that live there. So some things are clearly adapted and able to live there, some things would be less so. You're not going to see a polar bear hanging out in the desert. So that changes the biodiversity a little bit. If we don't have a polar bear, we don't have any of the other things that are needed to support the life of a polar bear, and so on. So some of the factors you may have thought of would be on this slide here. So did you think about how hot it is, the temperature? Did you think about the amount of rainfall or how dry it might be? You might have thought about the availability of food or what predators there are in that environment. Now you might not have thought of carbon dioxide level or the nitrate content of the soil, or indeed even of the pH of the environment. However, all of those things could influence the sorts of organisms that are able to live there and consequently will affect its biodiversity. Now, when we look at these factors, we are going to split them into living and non-living factors. So living factors are ones which are caused by any living organism, such as disease, competition, grazing, predation, or food availability. Whereas our non-living factors are more environmental, things like light intensity, moisture, pH, temperature, river flow rate, any one of those. And when we think about living and non-living factors, we refer to these using particular biological terms. So in biology, we refer to our living factors as biotic factors, and we refer to non-living factors as abiotic factors. So a biotic factor is simply something alive in the environment that may affect it or the organisms that can live there. When we look at biotic factors in a little bit more detail, one of them is disease, particularly relevant at the moment. So plants and animals can be infected by diseases which are caused by viruses, bacteria or fungi. And these infections tend to spread more quickly in crowded populations. Some individuals of the species may be naturally resistant to that disease and so will survive and be able to reproduce, giving us the next generation. However, that particular species may be reduced in its numbers for some years until the population can recover from the disease. We also have an element of competition, and this would be considered a living factor because it is living organisms competing against each other. Now, animals and plants will compete against members of the same species or against individuals of a different species, and that's to gain access to resources like food, water, shelter, or mates. And some species are adapted quite well to compete against different species. For example, we can see here there's a little bluebell wood, and all of those bluebells tend to flower a lot earlier in the season, and the reason for this is that they're trying to produce their flowers and grow their leaves before the trees have come into full leaf later on in the spring and the summer. And that's because once the trees have grown into full leaf, they'll be shading them from the light. Grazing is another biotic factor, and that's obviously the consumption of plant material by animals. Now, when grazing intensity is too high, biodiversity decreases dramatically. So the more animals you have in an area all grazing, the less plant species that are available. That in turn will support fewer insect species, fewer bird species, and so on. It's going to have quite a high impact. However, when grazing intensity is too low, if you don't have any plants if you don't have any animals eating the plants, then some plant species will actually just take over, will outcompete the other plant species, and that will actually reduce biodiversity. And in these pictures, you can see that on the left, we've got a field which has been quite highly grazed, whereas on the right, we've got a field which has been left with moderate grazing. So there have been some animals allowed through. That's reduced the number of species that can overcompete and allowed us to have a greater variety of different species in that field. Now, predators and prey are obviously living factors that are going to influence each other and change the biodiversity of an area quite significantly. A predator is any animal that will consume all or part of another animal to survive, whereas prey species are organisms that are eaten by a predator. And of course, there are some species that will actually be both. There will be some prey species which will eat other animals, smaller than them, however, will themselves be eaten by larger species. And the predator-prey population in an ecosystem are closely related to each other. As one increases, you tend to see the other increase within a year or so as a result of having a more available food source. Now, that brings us to food availability, and that generally relates to the different types of food that are available and how abundant they are, so how much of those types of foods there are and how they're distributed. And that food availability can depend on the weather, the time of year and the time of day. So, for example, if like in this picture, these wading birds are looking for food, they can only do that at low tide. So their food sources are only available at certain times of day, and that can influence the biodiversity of that particular area, as it will limit the number of species that are able to survive in that area, and it will change the number of species that are able to prey on those and interact with those species. So from that, you should be able to state that a biotic factor is any living factor which can influence the biodiversity of an area. That biotic factors would include predation, grazing, food availability, disease, as some examples. That any one of those can impact biodiversity depending on the environment itself and the types of organisms that it's going to affect.